Stanley Milgram. Many of you might be wondering, who is Stanley Milgram? He was a social psychologist who was born in the Bronx in 1933 to Jewish American parents who had just migrated from Eastern Europe. His mother was named Adele and his father was named Samuel. They owned a bakery and were a well-known bakery in the Bronx. He then later went on to marry his wife Alexandra, who was also known as Sasha, and they together had their daughter and son, Michelle and Mark. In December 1984, Stanley passed away due to a heart attack. Some highlights of Stanley Milgram's life include attending James Monroe High School. While at James Monroe High School, he met the requirements to graduate in 3 years instead of 4. He also was a participant in their honor society and was a stagehand for the theater group. Stanley then went on to Queens College in the Bronx, where he earned his Bachelor of Arts. While at Queens College, Stanley started to become familiar with what psychology was, and it sparked an interest. He then went on to attend Harvard's social psychology program. Before he got accepted, Stanley did not meet the requirements to be in the program. Even though he was a great scholar, he had to take 6 psychology courses to be able to be accepted into the social psychology program. That summer, Stanley did so and completed them all with great grades. He then was accepted into the program and was mentored by Solomon Asch. Upon completing his doctorate in social psychology from Harvard, Solomon and Stanley went on to the Institute of Advanced Study to do some more research together. Later on in his career, after he was finished being mentored by Solomon, Stanley accepted a position as a teaching assistant at Yale University. This is where he conducted many of his well-known research studies. To end his career, Stanley was the head of social psychology program at City University of New York. Stanley Milgram's research. One of the first research studies that Stanley was a part of was a study of conformity. This was conducted with Solomon Asch, and he adopted many of Solomon's research styles. Solomon Asch was greatly influenced by the Gestalt theory, and this really reflected into Milgram's work also due to his close relationship with Solomon. Stanley believed that simplicity was the key to an effective scientific inquiry. This led to their study. In this study, participants were led to believe they were participating in a study on perceptual judgment. During each trial, a participant was seated with 6 to 7 other participants. Each participant was presented with a visual stimulus, and the participant was to identify which of the beginning 3 lines was equal in length to the 4th. When the participants chose their answer, they were instructed to announce it to the group. It was really important to note that all participants were given the same stimuli, but the final participant at the table to announce their choice, but all but the final participants were Confederates. This study concluded that people do go towards conformity with what the majority says. Next, while at Harvard to finish his doctorate, Stanley went on to conduct the first cross-cultural study. This study was on the comparison of conformity between 2 different countries. This study was conducted in Norway and France from 1957 to 1959. Stanley based his study off of the previous study that he did with Solomon. The only thing that changed in the study, instead of the visual stimuli, they turned to auditory stimuli. So instead of looking at the length of the lines, participants then listened to the length of the sound. Stanley found that Norway had a much higher conformity level than France. Next, while at Yale University, Stanley went on to complete the obedience to authority experiment. This is also one of his most well-known experiments, and it's often referred to as the Milgram experiment. This experiment was examining the effects of punishment on learning. Stanley completed this by recruiting people and telling them that they were one would be a teacher and one would be a learner. The participants were instructed that it was their job to teach another subject to memorize a list of adjective, noun, word pairs. The participant, who was known as the teacher, sat in front of a shock panel. On the shock panel were 30 lever switches that all faced horizontally. Each lever switch corresponded with 15 volts. The switches ranged from 15 to 450 volts. The participant, who was the teacher, was told that whenever the learner in the adjacent room gave an incorrect answer, the teacher had to give them a shock. The teacher was told that after each subsequent error that they had to increase the shock that the learner received. Milgram yielded significant results from the data of this study. The results showed that approximately 2/3 of participants were obedient to authority and delivered the maximum shock level. Next, Stanley completed the lost letter technique. This experiment involved losing letters that were addressed to different recipients in different locations. Some of the places these letters were left in included stores, sidewalks, and social gathering places. The primary point of this study was to see if people would actually pick up the letters and mail them correctly after they saw where they would be addressed. Some examples of places that Stanley addressed the letters to were Friends of the Nazi Party or Friends of the Communist Party were mailed, or these were compared to letters that were addressed to medical research associates or a private individual. Stanley even used this study to predict the outcome of the Johnson-Goldwater presidential election. The next study that he completed was the small world problem. In this study, he gave a folder to a group of randomly selected participants in Omaha, Nebraska. This group of participants were known as the starters. These starters were informed to send the folder to a specific stockbroker in Boston. The starters could not deliver it directly to the stockbroker, but instead pass a folder from one close acquaintance to the next. Stanley found that only about 25% of chains were completed. The Life in the City experiment was to study the mental maps of New Yorkers and Parisians. Stanley believed that people make many important decisions based on their conception of a city rather than the reality of it. This study was based off a complaint that was made by Stanley's mother-in-law, who could not believe that young people would not give up their seat on a subway to elderly and those in need. The results revealed that about 56% of subjects gave up their seat without request to someone who in need. In the third study, Stanley focused on urban life. He named it Familiar Strangers. This was based off the concept that people often encounter the same people every day, but never interact with them. The final study conducted was the antisocial effects of television. A series of field experiments were conducted on the negative effects of television viewing. To conduct the series of experiments, Milgram gave participants the opportunity to steal money, donate to charity, or neither. Stanley measured the impact by testing the rate of influence from watching people conduct similar actions. Stanley's impact on psych today. Stanley was known for his groundbreaking research. He helped build social psychology and cross-cultural psychology. He also helped with the ethical treatment of participants and the creation of the IRB Review Board. Stanley is known and mentioned in many of the introductory psychology courses due to all of this groundbreaking research that he completed. The biggest thing that he did with his research was show that participants needed to be treated ethically, because in his Milgram experiment, many people had psychiatric problems and needed to seek therapy after they had completed his study. Thank you for watching my presentation, and here's a list of my sources.